Who are you? Not your name, not your job, not your nationality, or your religion, or your relationship status. Who are you when all of that is stripped away? Most people have never seriously asked this question. They assume the answer is obvious. They are the person they have always been, the person with this history, these habits, these preferences, these limitations, the person who reacts this way in difficult situations, the person who struggles with these particular things, the person who has always been like this and will probably always be like this. But what if that assumption, as natural and as obvious as it feels, is one of the most consequential mistakes a human being can make? What if the person you think you are is not who you actually are, but who you have learned to be, a construct built from the accumulated experiences of a lifetime, from the messages you received before you were old enough to evaluate them, from the adaptations you made to circumstances that no longer exist, from a story about yourself that was written mostly by forces outside your control, and that you have been living inside of without ever questioning whether it is true. Tonight, we are going to explore what the ancient traditions actually taught about the nature of the self and about the possibility of genuine transformation, not self-improvement, not positive thinking, not the addition of better habits on top of old ones, but something more fundamental, the actual recognition of what you are, beyond the person you think you are, and the practical possibility of living from that recognition in a way that actually changes things. In the next 45 minutes, we are going to draw on the teachings of the ancient mystery schools, the Vedic understanding of samskara and vasana, the Buddhist teaching on the constructed self, the Hermetic doctrine of inner transformation, and what modern neuroscience has discovered about the brain's capacity for genuine change, because the ancient wisdom and the modern science are pointing at the same thing, that the person you think you are is not fixed, is not permanent, is not the final truth about what you are, and that genuine freedom, genuine transformation is not only possible, it is your natural state, waiting beneath the person you have learned to be. Let us begin with what the person you think you are actually is. In modern neuroscience, the sense of being a consistent self, a continuous identity that persists through time, is understood as a construction of the brain, specifically of the default mode network, a network of brain regions that becomes active when you are not focused on any particular task, when you are daydreaming, ruminating, thinking about yourself. The default mode network generates the ongoing narrative of being you, the sense of a continuous self that woke up this morning as the same person who went to sleep last night, that has a past, a future, a consistent set of preferences and reactions. This narrative is useful. It allows you to learn from experience, to maintain relationships over time, to plan and commit and follow through. But it has a significant limitation. It is built from the past, from memory, from the accumulated experiences and adaptations of everything that has happened to you. And because it is built from the past, it tends to recreate the past, to interpret new situations through the lens of old ones, to respond to new circumstances with reactions that were formed in old circumstances. That may no longer be relevant. That may no longer be useful. That may in fact be actively limiting. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio describes the self as a narrative construction, a story the brain tells about itself. And like all stories, it can be retold. The ancient traditions understood this, not in the language of neuroscience, but in the language of their own frameworks. The Vedic tradition has a concept called samskara. Samskara means impression, the deep impressions left on the mind by repeated experience and repeated action. These impressions become patterns, tendencies, the habitual ways of thinking, feeling, and responding that constitute what we ordinarily think of as personality. The Vedic tradition also describes vasanas, latent tendencies, deeper patterns that underlie the surface habits, the fundamental orientations of the mind towards certain kinds of experience, the tendency toward fear or toward trust, toward contraction or toward openness, toward self-protection or toward engagement. Both samskaras and vasanas are understood in the Vedic tradition as the accumulated residue of past experience, real, powerful, capable of governing behavior almost entirely, if they are not recognized and worked with, but not permanent, not fixed, not the essential nature of the being. The Buddhist tradition describes something similar through the concept of anatta, no fixed self. The teaching that what we ordinarily call the self is not a fixed, independent, permanent entity, but a constantly changing process, a flow of experience, to which the mind adds the story of a consistent self, not because that story is false in every sense, but because it is more fluid, more open, more malleable than the story suggests. The Buddha taught that clinging to a fixed sense of self is one of the primary sources of suffering, because a fixed self must be defended, must be maintained, must be protected against everything that threatens it. And the energy that goes into that defense is energy that cannot go into genuine living, into genuine connection, into genuine presence. The Hermetic tradition, in its understanding of inner alchemy, describes the transformation of the self as the central work of the spiritual path, not the improvement of the existing self, but its dissolution and the recognition of what underlies it, the lead becoming gold, not through polishing, but through the alchemical fire of genuine inner work. What does this actually mean in practice? Let us look at how the person you think you are actually operates in your daily life. You wake up in the morning before you have consciously decided anything. The familiar sense of being you has already reasserted itself. The familiar concerns, the familiar mood, the familiar orientation toward the day. This happens automatically, without deliberate choice, because the default mode network, the narrative generating machinery of the brain, picks up where it left off, running the same patterns, telling the same story, generating the same self. Throughout the day, you encounter situations and you respond to them. But here is what most people do not notice. The responses are largely automatic, largely determined by the patterns, the samskaras and vasanas, the accumulated impressions of past experience, not by genuine present moment choice. Someone says something critical, the old familiar reaction arises, defensiveness, hurt, withdrawal, or anger, or people-pleasing, or self-doubt, whichever pattern was formed in response to criticism long ago. A familiar situation arises. The familiar feelings arise with it, not because this situation is the same as the old one, but because the pattern recognition system of the brain has flagged it as similar and activated the old response. This is the person you think you are, operating automatically, mostly unconsciously, recreating the past in the present. Not because you're broken, not because something is wrong with you, but because this is how the brain works. When it is not working with awareness, when the patterns are running rather than being observed. And this is where the ancient teaching becomes practical, because the traditions are unanimous on one point. The beginning of genuine transformation is not doing something different. It is seeing something more clearly, specifically seeing the patterns. The moment you can observe a pattern, rather than simply being run by it, something changes. Not the pattern itself, not immediately, but your relationship to it. The moment you see the defensive reaction arising and recognize it as a pattern, rather than identifying with it as who you are, a small but significant space opens between the stimulus and the response, between what happens and how you react. In that space, choice becomes possible. The Vedic tradition calls this practice svadhyaya, self-study, the deliberate observation of the patterns of your own mind, not with judgment, not with the goal of fixing or eliminating the patterns, but with clear and compassionate seeing. What is actually happening here? What pattern is running? What old response is being activated by this present situation? The Buddhist tradition calls this vipassana, insight meditation, the practice of observing the arising and passing of mental phenomena without identification, without adding the story of a self who is having these experiences, simply watching, noticing. The Hermetic tradition calls it the work of the nigredo, the confrontation with the shadow, the willingness to look at what is actually operating in the depths of the conditioned self, without turning away. All of these practices, despite their different frameworks and different languages, are pointing at the same fundamental capacity, the capacity to observe the person you think you are, rather than simply being that person, to step back from identification with the construct and recognize that you are the awareness in which the construct is arising, not the construct itself. This recognition, even briefly, even partially, changes everything, because the construct, the person you think you are, loses some of its power to govern behavior automatically. The moment it is seen clearly, the pattern does not disappear immediately, but it begins to lose its grip. The defensive reaction still arises, but it is seen as a reaction, not taken as the truth, not acted from automatically, held with enough awareness that a different response becomes possible. This is the beginning of genuine transformation, not the dramatic overnight change of popular self-help culture, but the gradual, consistent, patient work of bringing awareness to the patterns again and again in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life. Now let me offer you something practical, a specific practice drawn from the ancient traditions that supports this work directly. It is called the witness practice, and it is both very simple and very powerful. Several times throughout the day, set a reminder if necessary. Pause, take one slow breath, and ask yourself, what pattern is running right now? Not, what am I thinking or feeling? But, what pattern is this? Is this the familiar anxiety pattern? The familiar self-criticism pattern? The familiar people-pleasing pattern? The familiar avoidance pattern? Name it. Not to judge it, not to fix it. Simply to see it. To recognize this is a pattern. This is something that has been running automatically. And I am now seeing it. That seeing itself is the beginning of freedom from it. Because you cannot be free from something you cannot see. And you cannot see something you are entirely identified with. The moment of recognition, the moment of stepping back from the pattern, even briefly, is a moment of genuine transformation. Not the dramatic kind, the real kind, the kind that accumulates over time into something genuinely different, a different quality of presence, a different quality of choice, a life lived less from the automatic patterns of the past and more from the genuine awareness of what is actually here, right now, in this moment. Subscribe to Sacred Flame, because this exploration continues. Until next time, ask the question, what pattern is running right now? See it clearly, and in that seeing, remember what you are, not the pattern, the awareness that sees it, that has always been here, beneath the person you think you are, waiting only for your recognition. Let me go deeper into something that the ancient traditions understood, that modern self-help culture almost always misses. The difference between suppressing a pattern and transforming it. Most approaches to personal change, whether they call themselves spiritual or psychological or practical, are fundamentally about suppression, about replacing one behavior with another, about using willpower and discipline to override the automatic patterns, to force yourself to act differently, even when the old reaction is still pulling strongly. This approach has limited effectiveness because the pattern itself has not changed. Only the surface behavior has changed. The underlying tendency is still there, still active, still looking for expression, and the energy required to suppress it is significant, exhausting over time, and prone to collapse under sufficient stress. This is why so many people who have worked hard on themselves find that under genuine pressure, the old patterns reassert themselves, the old reactions return. The person they thought they had left behind turns out to be still there, waiting. The ancient traditions were pointing at something different, not the suppression of patterns, but their transformation. And transformation, in the genuine sense, requires going deeper than the behavior, deeper than the thought, to the emotional and energetic root, where the pattern actually lives. The Vedic tradition teaches that the samskaras, the deep impressions that generate habitual patterns, are stored not primarily in the mind, but in the body, in the physical tissues, in the nervous system, in the posture and the breath and the tension patterns of the physical body. This is why purely intellectual understanding never produces complete transformation. You can understand a pattern perfectly, trace its origins with complete clarity, analyze its mechanisms with sophisticated precision, and still be run by it, because the pattern is not primarily intellectual, it is somatic, it lives in the body, and transformation requires working at that level. The ancient practices that supported genuine transformation always included the body. Pranayama, breathwork, directly addressed the patterns held in the breath. Yoga, conscious physical practice, addressed the patterns held in posture and tension. Ritual bathing and fasting addressed the patterns held in the physical vehicle itself. Modern somatic psychology has rediscovered this understanding. The work of Peter Levine on somatic experiencing, of Bessel van der Kolk on the body keeping the score, of Wilhelm Reich character armor, all pointing at the same recognition. The patterns that limit us are held in the body, and genuine transformation requires working with the body, not just the mind. The practice I want to offer you here is a simple somatic awareness practice. When you notice a familiar pattern arising, the familiar anxiety, the familiar defensiveness, the familiar contraction, instead of trying to think your way out of it or suppress it through willpower, pause and bring your attention to the body. Where do you feel this pattern in the body? Is there tightness in the chest, constriction in the throat, tension in the belly, a change in the breath? Find the physical location of the pattern and simply be with it. Not to fix it, not to make it go away, but to actually feel it, to allow the sensation to be fully present, without adding the mental story on top of it, without the narrative about what the feeling means, or how long it will last, or what it says about you. Just the raw sensation in the body, held with awareness. What happens when you do this often surprises people. The sensation that seemed unbearable, when it was being avoided or suppressed, becomes manageable when it is actually felt. Sometimes it shifts, sometimes it releases, sometimes it reveals something beneath it, a deeper feeling that was underneath the surface reaction. This is the somatic work of transformation. Not dramatic, not always comfortable, but real and cumulative over time. Now let me bring this teaching into the specific context of relationships, because this is where the patterns are most visible and most impactful. The person you think you are shows up most clearly in relationship with others. The patterns that were formed in early relationship express themselves most powerfully in current relationship. The way you respond to conflict, the way you respond to intimacy, the way you respond to criticism or praise, the way you manage closeness and distance. These patterns were largely formed before you had the capacity to choose them consciously. They were adaptations, intelligent adaptations to the specific relational environment of your childhood, ways of navigating the world. That made sense given what was available then, but that may not serve you now, may in fact be creating the opposite of what you actually want. The person who learned that love was conditional and adapted by becoming a people pleaser may now find that the people pleasing prevents the genuine connection they are seeking. The person who learned that vulnerability was dangerous and adapted by becoming emotionally defended may now find that the defenses prevent the intimacy they actually want. The ancient traditions understood this. The concept of karma in the Vedic tradition is often misunderstood as cosmic justice, as punishment for past actions. But its deeper meaning is simply the principle of cause and effect applied to the inner life. The patterns formed in the past cause the experiences of the present, not as punishment, as simple consequence. And the path of freedom from karma is not the avoidance of its consequences, but the transformation of the patterns that generate those consequences. This is the practical meaning of the teaching. Break free from the person you think you are, not by rejecting that person, not by criticizing or shaming that person, but by seeing clearly that the person is a construct, a collection of adaptations, a set of patterns built from the past and running in the present, and by recognizing that you are not the patterns. You are the awareness in which the patterns arise. And awareness can do what patterns cannot. It can choose. It can respond rather than react. It can meet the present moment with fresh eyes rather than the eyes of the past. This is the freedom the ancient traditions were pointing at. Not freedom from difficulty, not freedom from challenge or loss or pain, but freedom from the automatic repetition of the past. Freedom to actually be here, in this moment, as this awareness, rather than as the accumulated story of everything that has happened before. Let me close with a practice that ties everything together. The ancient traditions called it the evening review. Before sleep, spend 10 minutes reviewing the day, not to judge it, not to criticize yourself for where you fell short, but to observe it, as if watching a film. Which moments today was the familiar person running? Which reactions arose automatically? Which patterns expressed themselves? Simply notice, without judgment. And then, in each of those moments, ask what was actually needed here, not what the pattern provided. What was actually called for? What would genuine awareness have chosen if it had been present? This is not about regret. It is about learning, about developing the capacity to see the patterns more clearly, so that tomorrow they have slightly less power and genuine choice has slightly more. This is the work, patient, consistent, honest, the work of breaking free from the person you think you are, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, day by day, pattern by pattern, recognition by recognition, until the awareness that you are is no longer obscured by the person you have learned to be, until what remains is not a better version of the old self, but something more fundamental, more free, more genuinely you than the person you thought you were ever was. Subscribe to Sacred Flame, because this work continues, video by video. Until next time, see the pattern, feel it in the body, recognize what you are beneath it, and choose, even once, even briefly, from that deeper place. That is the beginning of everything. There is one more dimension of this teaching that I want to bring forward, something that the ancient traditions understood deeply, but that is rarely discussed in modern conversations about transformation. The role of community, the role of genuine relationship with others who are doing the same work. The ancient mystery schools were not primarily schools of individual practice. They were communities, groups of people committed to the same inner work, supporting each other through the process. The Pythagorean Brotherhood, the Eleusinian community, the early Sufi orders, the monastic communities of every tradition, all understood that genuine transformation is not a solo project, that the patterns we are trying to see clearly are often most visible to others, that the blind spots we have about ourselves are precisely the places where another person's honest and caring observation can be invaluable. The Vedic tradition has a concept called satsang, literally company of the true, the gathering of people who are committed to truth, to genuine inner work, to the recognition of what is real. The tradition holds that satsang is one of the most powerful supports for genuine transformation, not because group practice is somehow more effective than individual practice, but because the quality of awareness and sincerity in the group raises the quality of awareness and sincerity in each individual. We are profoundly influenced by who we spend time with, by the conversations we have, by the questions that are considered worth asking, by what is treated as important and what is treated as trivial. if you spend most of your time in environments where the inner life is never mentioned, where depth and genuine inquiry are considered unusual or impractical, the work of transformation is significantly harder. Not impossible, but harder. And if you can find even one or two people with whom genuine conversation about these things is possible, the work becomes lighter, more sustainable, more alive. This is one of the reasons this channel exists, not just to transmit information, but to create a space, a kind of virtual satsang, in which these questions are treated as the most important questions a human being can ask. Because they are. Who are you really? What are you beyond the person you have learned to be? What becomes possible when that person is seen clearly and the awareness beneath it is recognized? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are the most practical questions available, because the answers, or rather, the genuine inquiry into the answers, changes the quality of everything, of relationships, of work, of creativity, of health, of the moment-to-moment experience of being alive. The ancient teachers devoted their lives to this inquiry. The mystery schools were built around it, and what they discovered through centuries of careful inner work is available to you right now in the ordinary circumstances of an ordinary life. You do not need a mystery school. You do not need a realized teacher. You need the willingness to actually look at the person you think you are, with honesty, with compassion, with the genuine curiosity of someone who suspects that what they have been told they are is not the whole story, because it is not. The whole story is much larger, much more free, much more extraordinary than the person you have learned to be has ever been able to show you. Subscribe to Sacred Flame, because this is the work we are doing here, together, video by video, recognition by recognition. Until next time. Question the story, see the pattern, feel the body, and recognize, even for a moment, what you are when the story falls quiet. That recognition is worth everything. I want to explore something that I think is one of the most practically useful dimensions of this teaching. The relationship between the person you think you are and the quality of your attention. Because one of the clearest signs that the constructed self is running is a particular quality of attention. Scattered, reactive, pulled from one thing to the next, constantly evaluating, constantly comparing, constantly filtering experience through the question, what does this mean for me? This quality of attention is the attention of the defended self, the self that is constantly managing its relationship with the world, trying to get more of what it wants and less of what it fears. And it is exhausting, not because life is so demanding, but because the self-management project never stops, never takes a break, never rests. There is another quality of attention, one that most people have experienced, but only briefly, in moments of genuine absorption, when you are completely engaged with something and the self-monitoring temporarily stops. An artist lost in the work, a musician absorbed in the music, a child playing so completely that the ordinary self-consciousness disappears. These moments feel different, lighter, more alive, more real, not because the circumstances are better, but because the defensive self-management has paused. And what remains is a quality of open, receptive, undivided attention. This quality of attention is what the ancient traditions were pointing at when they described the liberated state. not a special emotional state, not permanent bliss or joy or peace, but a quality of attention that is no longer primarily organised around the defence and promotion of a self. That can simply be here, with what is actually here, without the constant overlay of self-referential commentary. The practice of cultivating this quality of attention is simpler than most people expect, and more challenging than most people want, because it requires the willingness to stop, repeatedly, consistently, without agenda, to simply be present, without trying to get anything from the present moment, without trying to change it, without trying to evaluate it, just here, noticing what is actually present, the sounds, the sensations, the breath, the simple fact of being aware. This is the practice beneath all the practices, the essential movement that all the other techniques are pointing toward, the willingness to stop organising experience around a self, and to simply be present with what is. Let me offer you a specific way to practice this. In the middle of an ordinary activity, walking, washing dishes, waiting for something, stop the internal commentary, not by forcing silence, but by directing attention outward to what is actually here, the sounds in the environment, the physical sensations of the body, the quality of the light, the texture of what you are touching, not labeling these things, not evaluating them, simply receiving them, letting experience be what it is, without the constant overlay of the self's commentary. And notice what happens to the quality of your experience. When the self-referential commentary pauses, even for 30 seconds, even briefly, something shifts, a quality of freshness, of aliveness, of simple presence that was there all along, but was obscured by the constant activity of the constructed self. This is what the ancient traditions called presence, and it is not a rare or mystical state. It is the natural condition of awareness. When it is not constantly organised around the maintenance of a self, it is available to you right now, in this moment, in the middle of your ordinary life. The person you think you are is a construction built from the past, real and important in its own way, but not what you ultimately are, and breaking free from it does not require dramatic action. It requires attention, patient, consistent, honest attention to what is actually here, in this moment, beyond the story, beyond the pattern, beyond the person. Just this, just awareness, just presence, just you as you actually are. Subscribe to Sacred Flame, because this is the work, and it is the most important work available. Until next time, stop, be here, notice what remains when the story pauses, and recognize that what remains was always what you were looking for. Let me address something directly that I think is important for anyone seriously engaging with this teaching. The question of time. How long does genuine transformation actually take? Because there is a version of this teaching that implies it should happen quickly. That if you simply see the pattern clearly enough, it will dissolve immediately. That recognition alone is sufficient for complete freedom. And there is truth in this. Genuine recognition, even briefly, does change something, does create a shift in relationship to the pattern. But complete transformation, the full embodiment of what is recognized, takes time, takes consistent practice, takes the patient application of awareness to the same patterns again and again until they have genuinely lost their grip. The ancient traditions were honest about this. The Vedic tradition speaks of lifetimes of practice. The Buddhist tradition describes the gradual path in which insight deepens incrementally through sustained practice over years. The Hermetic tradition describes the great work as the work of a lifetime, not because transformation is impossible, but because the conditioning that created the patterns is deep, and the unwinding of that conditioning happens at the pace at which genuine integration can occur. This is not discouraging, it is simply honest. And honesty about the actual nature of the work is itself an act of respect, because a person who expects instant transformation and does not find it will likely abandon the practice, concluding that it does not work, when in fact it is working, just at the pace that genuine transformation actually moves, slowly, incrementally, with occasional breakthroughs and long periods of apparently ordinary practice that are in fact laying the foundation for the next shift. The instruction is simple: keep practicing, not because you are not there yet, but because the practice itself is the living. The awareness you bring to this moment, to this pattern, to this response, is not a means to an end. It is the end itself, lived moment by moment. This is the freedom the ancient traditions were pointing at. Not a destination to be reached, but a quality of attention to be cultivated again and again in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life. Subscribe to Sacred Flame. Until next time, practice not to get somewhere, but to be here fully as what you actually are, beyond the person you think you are. That is the whole teaching, and it is enough.